Xin chào. It's wonderful to be back in Vietnam. I still come back quite regularly. As Spencer mentioned, I was stationed here for about 3.5 years. Back in 2015, I started and live in Singapore now. Continue to travel around the region, and am still actively involved in the Vietnamese cattle and beef industry. And it's been my absolute honour to work with Greg and others in the market over that time, and to see the changes that have happened. It's been a challenge to get to where we are. It's happened very, very quickly relative to how things are happening in other countries, or even happened in Australia. And Vietnamese should be very, very proud of how quickly things have changed. And it's a real testament to the Vietnamese and the entrepreneurial spirit to see the opportunities and be able to capitalize on those opportunities. Today, I've been tasked with talking about animal welfare and integrity, and I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on the concept of integrity. Now, integrity in the supply chain is probably something that warrants a whole day or a few days worth of talking about. I've got 15 minutes, which I'm probably going to push through, but to talk about it. So it's complex when we start talking and getting into the concepts that Greg's talking about of value adding our meat and doing further things for our product. For me, integrity, basically translates to honesty and being honest about what's happening through the supply chain. Now, integrity has always existed in Vietnam. Yeah, there's always been integrity because we've had traders and people that have been moving product between. Integrity doesn't mean we're doing a higher value thing, doesn't mean we're doing good production, doesn't mean anything of that. It just means basically that there's honesty going through the supply chain between different parties. And it's not one thing. Yeah, integrity is a lot of things. Yeah, and again, why it could be a whole conversation that we're having. Integrity is about antibiotic resistance. It can be about disease controls between humans and animals. We've got illegal imports that are coming in, unofficial trade coming in, substitution, counterfeiting. All of these things, contribute to the ability for us to differentiate our product. And that product might be the animals, or it might be the meat product that we're selling. Every one of these aspects costs money to be able to continue to maintain that integrity and pass that value through the supply chain. And we start getting into things like food safety, transparency and trust. Animal welfare is one aspect of integrity, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, and then you've got sustainable livestock farming and waste and all the other things that we were talking about yesterday. There's lots here. There's plenty here. There's lots of aspects that need to be covered. It's important for young consumers that are coming through. It's becoming a really relevant thing. And the most relevant thing for the cattle and beef industry in Vietnam is now that imported product is being accepted into the market. There's a lot more imported product. It already has basically all of these attributes. The imported product naturally has aspects of this integrity already existing. The Vietnamese cattle industry, to do what Greg's talking about, needs to continue to build towards having something that has spent 50, 100 years developing in some developed countries. It needs to have a rapid development to be able to have the same level of integrity as the imported product that's coming in. And we'll talk about that later through this talk. It's quite ironic, that there's a few conversations about abattoirs and meat distribution happening right at the end of this symposium. For me, it's the biggest problem that we have and the biggest limitation for us doing anything beyond just having a local supply chain that's hobby farming, as it was referred to earlier. Yeah, that we've just got a few cattle trading through the supply chain. If we can't fix up what's happening both in the abattoirs and meat distribution for local supply, and that might be from Australian animals or from local animals, if we can't fix up the abattoir system and the meat distribution system to compete with imported product, then there will not be a Vietnam cattle industry as a large commercial industry existing in the future. I say that quite strongly. I honestly believe that if this isn't reformed, if there isn't major reform happening here, then it will remain as it traditionally has, with some small abattoirs and some small numbers of local cattle processing through it. Why do I say that? And what's happened for me to say that? Before roughly 2014, this is before the Australian cattle came into the supply chain, your abattoirs were small backyard abattoirs, no infrastructure. This picture was actually taken on the second day of my job at MLA. On the right-hand side is someone using a sledgehammer in the abattoir, and this is how the cattle were basically processed back 2014 and before. Sledgehammers, cattle were knocked down, cut throats, maybe 5 head, processed through an abattoir a night. As a large abattoir, often it might be 5 head a week. So very small abattoirs, but the whole animal was sold. You know, Vietnam had a perfect system. We'll talk about balancing the carcass later. Vietnam had the perfect system existing. You know, the animal's killed, it goes to all the different people. Someone will take the skin, someone will take the stomach, the meat, you know, distributed to the different channels, and it worked really, really well. Frozen meat was yesterday's meat, you know, it was no good, and the consumers didn't like it. Yeah, they knew it was rubbish meat or was going to make them sick, so that was downgraded in price and not accepted. And the system existed with local abattoirs in the local area. Obviously, at that stage, there wasn't much consideration for animal welfare. You know, we didn't have any real tools. There was no infrastructure development at that time, but there was still integrity. Yeah, there was trust between the different parties in the supply chain. So that integrity came from traders, from people that were moving the animals, from people that were trading the meat further down the supply chain. That's what created the integrity. The integrity, if you traded a product to somebody and they didn't like the quality, they wouldn't trade with you the next day. They'd go buy meat from somebody else. So that innately created integrity within the supply chain. What happened when Australian cattle came? But at that stage, basically, we're not talking a large commercial operations. There's no feedlots, anything. Australian cattle turn up. We start getting a consistency of supply, both in terms of quality, but also in terms of the size and weight and performance in the abattoirs for meat yield. So Australian cattle come in, there's greater consistency, and there's open availability for animals. You don't no longer have to go down to a farm and try to find 5 animals to put on a truck. You know, you just go to a feedlot and suddenly there's all these cattle sitting at a feedlot that are all basically going to meat yield exactly the same. And this consistency in supply essentially changed the dynamics from a commercial production system within Vietnam. At that stage, our abattoirs didn't really change. There's you can see a restraint box in the back there. So a restraint box was built to handle the animals, and pens were built to be able to move the animals or hold the animals, especially Australian animals, and then move them up the restraint box. There was investment in stunners, so all the cattle were then stunned in the abattoirs. And all of this investment happened, you know, basically because the Australian cattle were coming through. So there's an SCAS system. Those that are not aware, there's a regulation from Australian animals, feeder and slaughter animals coming into Vietnam or any country overseas, that they must be regulated for animal welfare to meet high animal welfare standards. So that forced infrastructure investment by abattoirs and those in the supply chain to build large feedlots, to build and improve their abattoirs so that they could handle those animals. So what ended up happening initially in the initial days of SCAS happening, 2015, 2016, there was a lot of movement of the cattle under what you would call traditional sales channels for the livestock, which meant that the cattle were then sold off a truck midway to an abattoir, and they would get rerouted to another abattoir and killed at another abattoir. So we call that leakage, or animals moving outside the SCAS supply chain. There was lots of this happening, yeah, under what was normal in Vietnam, happening in trading before. The SCAS system didn't let that happen, which meant that those abattoirs that were well regulated, or when SCAS was well regulated, meant that animals were going to specific abattoirs. At one stage, there was 100 roughly abattoirs in Vietnam that were receiving, this is at the peak of supply, 2017, roughly around there was about 100 abattoirs that were receiving Australian cattle, and those abattoirs were being improved, slowly being improved, more infrastructure. There's CCTV cameras in all the abattoirs. I think you can probably see one in the top left-hand corner, or about 5 in the top left-hand corner. CCTV cameras to do traceability and control of the livestock. There was a lot of monitoring happening, lots of staff working around the supply chain to monitor and manage the animal welfare that was happening. Training, all these things were happening. So the training then, so from an integrity perspective, we got these animal welfare improvements. From an integrity perspective, for the Australian livestock, what we started happening was we had all this validation processes happening. So there were systems and lots of expense and investment, making sure that we could validate our integrity within the supply chain. So we've come a long way, really, really fast. Yeah, and what Greg was talking about is the next level. Yeah, is what's happening in the future, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. But that's a small part of the supply chain, really, really small part of the supply chain, but a really important future part of the supply chain. We've come a long way, and be really, really proud of what anybody has been involved in here, from a supply of livestock into the Vietnamese supply chain, exporters from managing their SCAS, importers from doing an amazing job, and abattoir owners from doing an amazing job improving their abattoirs and processing the meat. And then companies that are now looking to do something else with their meat. But what's happened to the industry in the last really 2 years is really, really, really relevant to what can happen in the future and what needs to happen. COVID did a lot of things in Vietnam and Indonesia and in Indonesia. What's happened is that because the people couldn't go to the wet markets, or they couldn't afford beef because of cost of living crisis that's been happening here, it's meant that there's been a massive consumption decrease from traditional channels, from the way that the meat, or from beef, the way beef was traded through traditional channels. What that's happened is now that a lot of the meat traders or the beef traders have realised, or were forced to trade frozen meat coming from overseas, and now understand that that's actually probably a little bit easier. And the consistency's higher. It innately has integrity. We talked about at the beginning, it already has the food safety, it already has the cold chain, it already has the quality assurance with it. So this meat now already has all of these traits happening with it. And you know what the best thing is? You don't have to trade the whole animal anymore. You only have to trade whichever cuts you want. So if I can only sell the shin shank, I only have to buy shin shank now. I don't have to buy the whole animal, or an abattoir doesn't have to sell the whole animal. More importantly, what it did, it meant that because that was happening, the Vietnamese system, which was working perfectly, really, really well, the whole animal was being sold from abattoirs, is now competing with all of this imported product where they only have to bring in the shin shank, which is cheaper than processing the shin shank here. Or the tenderloin, which in Australia, most of the value comes from a small part of the animal, from the loin cuts. So those loin cuts can be traded anywhere globally, and I think I'm jumping ahead with my slides, but it meant that we can no longer compete with the products that are coming in. The really, really important thing is the Vietnamese system has to change because it is working within an international context now. It's working against and trading against imported product. The other thing that happened at the very same time, basically, Australian cattle prices were high, and from an integrity perspective, we had an issue with salbutamol, with beta agonists, with the cattle coming over from Thailand and from Vietnamese cattle and from Australian cattle that were also being fed salbutamol, to be honest. So we've got an issue with all of these animals. We've lost a lot of trust with the local consumers for locally processed beef in Vietnam, and that's going to be expensive to get back. It's always expensive to get trust back. So if we're talking, I mentioned that we have to compete with an international market now. So how do international companies, how do large, global exporters, et cetera, make money from abattoirs and make money in their supply chain? Because we're competing against them now, right? We have to compete against them. If we have to compete against them, we have to understand how they work. Basically, they have to have high standards for food safety and animal welfare. They have lots of trust, and they have lots of market access. That market access is really important because it means that they get to sell meat wherever they want to in the world. So Australia can export meat wherever they want. They can sell tenderloins to Korea and mince to US, and wherever they want to sell, they can sell to make the most money from the entire carcass. Vietnam, of course, can only sell in Vietnam. So that's really, really significant. The other significant thing that happens in modern abattoirs is they got higher overheads. So lots of infrastructure costs. We know how beautiful these large abattoirs overseas are. lots of infrastructure costs, which means that its cost of processing one animal is quite high, which means that we need to do down the bottom, high volumes and experts or high export markets become the two key things. Yeah, we can add value by sending and selling value where there is value in the world. Yeah, and the second one is if we do high enough volumes, means we only have to make a little bit from every animal. Yeah, when we're not making a lot of money, we can just sell a lot of animals. Vietnam processes 1 million cattle a year, roughly 1.2 or something million cattle a year. Yeah, that's not high volumes. So even if we only had 1 or 2 abattoirs working, yeah, it's going to be hard for Vietnam to have the volumes going through it. You know, we got some friends from Laos here as well, and investment in these really, really large abattoirs is great, but the local supply of the cattle into those abattoirs is the challenge. Yeah, that consistent supply of animals into those abattoirs is the challenge. Vietnam, low volume, no access to export markets. So we'll come back to animal welfare and integrity. From an animal welfare side, as I mentioned, the SCAS standards were met, and it absolutely improved the supply chain. There's no doubt that there was a lot of changes. Again, we had feedlots that were built, abattoirs built. Really, really important to how that to what's happened. We still need a lot of training. There's constant turnover of staff. Every country has an issue with staff and turnover of staff. There's a constant need for constant, training to be done. Training. Whether that training is at a basic level or to be able to do what Greg's talking about. Yeah, there's what Greg was talking about just now is a whole nother field that basically there's zero knowledge base in Vietnam about, at least at a commercial level. There's one abattoir owner here that I'm aware of today, and we're talking about abattoirs and meat processing. Yeah, so there's a massive gap here for how to process a complex animal such as beef cattle in Vietnam. And we don't have the capability and everything here. So there's a lot of training still needed. In terms of what it's done, it created systems for captive bolts and monitoring, which evolved around the Australian animals, but was only for the Australian animals and was specifically for the Australian animals. There's a real opportunity and need to expand that to all animals. If we are only doing integrity in one group of animals, then we're pricing them out of the market because integrity costs money. Yeah, if integrity costs money and only half of the market's receiving that integrity, then you're basically creating an extra cost for yourself, especially if we're not getting extra value for animals. And the only way we can get extra value for animals is if we start processing higher value product at the other side. Yes, we still have to have the whole chain connected to get the value to the consumer, which, as Greg said, doesn't really exist yet because they don't know how to sell the meat. And even if we did know how to sell the meat, we haven't got the abattoir capability to produce and process that meat yet anyway. Yeah, so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to still get that value through the supply chain. What we can do is make sure that everyone's managed equally. Yeah, so whether they're Australian animals or local animals, yeah, we need consistency in the way that those regulations are being enforced. The fact that we now have these animal welfare standards have been approved in Vietnam is amazing. I'm really, really excited about that going through. It creates a base now where Vietnam can regulate, yeah, equally to what the Australian animals are receiving. As I mentioned, the animal welfare standards going through, chilled meat standards going through, the border closures and managing the salbutamol issue coming over from the rest of Asia. Really, really important. And the government is doing what it can, I guess, at this stage, which is really admirable, and it needs to continue to enforce those regulations on a consistent basis. If we don't get consistent regulation and consistent enforcement of that regulation, the outliers within the supply chain will undermine all the good work that everybody else is doing. We need to probably, I think one of the previous speakers, I'll give you credit, but I can't remember who it was talking about going back to basics, yeah, and not looking at shiny toys. So the stuff that Greg's talking about, stuff in terms of proving abattoirs, there's a lot of things we can do. We can build a $10 million abattoir and tell everybody how great it is and have all of the greatest technology around. We need to understand why we're doing it and how to make money from it first. Do it at a low volume, do it at a low volume of animals going through to understand how that works so that we can remain profitable and sustainable to build through the supply chain and not get too distracted by technology, farm to fork, data, all this other stuff. We can create integrity through the supply chain using what already exists. We don't need to get excited about that and spend money there. We need to spend money where it's needed in the supply chain, which is building quality abattoirs and getting people understanding how to trade meat through that supply chain. So we can't predict Vietnam's beef industry future, but we can look around the world, and specifically can look around the region in terms of solutions of what can potentially happen. As I mentioned before, there's roughly 1.3 million head killed in Vietnam. Good enough estimate. We theoretically could have 5 abattoirs processing high quality chilled meat that can go into distribution channels and can go into supermarkets. Could supply 500,000 head into supply chains in Vietnam at a high value, like Greg's talking about. It would create pull through the supply chain. So it would mean that our disease control would happen because we'd have quarantine yards, we'd have disease-free areas that could potentially allow for export of that meat to go into international markets. We could have more productive, larger supply chains, could feed back through the supply chain. So we can have linkages to export yards and feedlots in Australia that are sending cattle over to specific supply chains going through marketed meat. That's all very possible to do, but it's going to require investment from overseas into meat processing, and the biggest challenge is it's going to require businesses to learn carcasses in competition with imported products. So that's what Greg has been working on and needs to continue to evolve. The last thing it needs is for consistency and regulation of the abattoirs. So there's no way these large abattoirs, this system that I'm talking about, could possibly exist if small abattoirs continue to operate the way they're operating. So there needs massive consolidation of the abattoir sector in general. As you see in all developed countries that have a developed, mature beef industry, there has to be consolidation. If you don't do consolidation, if you don't have consolidation of abattoirs, that doesn't work. The system doesn't work, and you end up with a few little niche supply chains that are operating. And this is the other option that is very possible in Vietnam, is that you'll still have, your million head of local animals that are killed in Vietnam going into local supply chains, basically as they currently are. And there's essentially no real change to the system. You've got a disease control mechanism because you've got lots of small abattoirs around the country. You've got a ability to supply local meat in a local fashion to local consumers, and the system is fine. And then maybe there's 20,000, 50,000, I don't know, could even be 100,000 head of cattle going through higher value supply chains, hitting niche markets. This exists in the Philippines. It exists in Thailand, are 2 really good examples of how this works. They have their supply chain vertically integrated. They sell the meat, have offtake for their meat, all organized in their own branded product. The cattle come in, fed to a specific reason, or even bred specifically for those supply chains, and the meat is sold in their own integrity system because they can control it. And we see it with TH and Vinamilk. The only way that TH and Vinamilk and Masan with Meat Life on the pork side, the way they've controlled and created that opportunity, that supply chain, is because they basically went vertically integrated and controlled their entire supply chain. That can absolutely exist in Vietnam. And we're seeing a few examples of that potentially happening, but they have to control and understand how to control their entire supply chain. There's less investment needed. Basically, I don't even know what I'm trying to say down the bottom there, but basically the system can continue to operate as it is, but we're going to have decreased exports from Australia. That's just going to be a natural fact that we decrease in exports from Australia, and there'll be these niche little supply chains that'll happen. So I guess before Spencer runs me off stage, that really need to, I guess, be really proud about all the rapid developments that we're having. It is quite amazing how quickly Vietnam has changed, and I believe will continue to change in the beef sector and every sector. The ability to adopt technology, all of this AI and genetics and everything, the production and feeding that was talked about over the last day and a half, it is happening. You know, the companies that want to adopt it have the ability to adapt and take this technology and use this technology really, really well and really quickly. And the market is finding its own level constantly with all this new technology. So be really proud about all the rapid developments happening. The legal standards are creating a framework that we can work from, which is, you know, awesome. It's really great that we've got that base from the government. But without any further abattoir development, you know, the rest of the beef industry can't modernise. So there's no real point in having better genetics and feeding the animals better as a whole industry, as a whole modern industry, if we also don't adapt and modernise our abattoir and beef distribution part of the supply chain. We just need to acknowledge animal welfare, integrity, traceability, the environment, how important they are, but generally they come at a cost. So if they're coming at a cost, we need to find a way that we can get more value from the animals. If we don't get more value from the animal by consumption, by the consumers that are willing to pay more, then everything just becomes too expensive, and the businesses that are already making such little money go out of business, right? So we need to find a way to get more money. So there needs to be more focus on getting more value from those animals. And we just need to acknowledge that we're competing in a global system now. Yeah, what happened even 3 years ago and what everyone understood about the beef supply chain in Vietnam 3 years ago is no longer what the Vietnamese beef industry looks like today. Yeah, it has changed. And I guess from my side, you know, training and infrastructure support is constantly needed. Yeah, so there's been a lot of investment. Having Australian livestock here has allowed that investment to happen from the exporters. As long as that export's still happening, we're going to continue to get investment. Yeah, but if that volume starts to decrease, it doesn't remove the need to do training and infrastructure investment. Yeah, so we need to find new mechanisms to be able to make that sustainable because it's a constant need within the supply chain.